When Japan first began its journey towards democratization, the parliament was made up of members selected in yokusan elections held during the war. It was barely functioning. First of all, what is a yokusan elections? This was an election in which candidates who followed the wishes of the government and military were classified as recommended and those who did not were classified as non-recommended. As a result, 381 of the successful candidates were people recommended by the government and 85 were not recommended by the government. The parliament that was formed through such elections eventually formed the Yokusan Seijikai and began to play a role in supporting the wartime regime. However, towards the end of the war, the Yokusan Seijikai was dissolved and a new group of lawmakers called the Greater Japan Political Association was formed. At the end of the war, the Greater Japan Political Association held an overwhelming majority in the Imperial Diet. Parliament had been reduced to a mere appendage that rubber-stamped the government's will. Of course, not everyone thought this was a good thing. Even during the war, there were people who opposed the total war system. They were subject to repression. However, once the war ended, they began preparations to build a new Japan. There was an intensified movement to form new political parties and to reconstitute parliament. Thus, after the war, new political parties were formed one after another in Japan. The earliest to begin activities was this man, who was elected without a recommendation in the Yokusan elections. During the war, he was anti-Yokusan and anti-Tojo and opposed the total war system. That man was Ichiro Hatoyama. He formed a group called Daikukai, centered around lawmakers who, like himself, had been elected in the Yokusan elections without being recommended by the ruling party. Daikukai had been gradually preparing to form a new party since just before the end of the war. Their meeting happened to be scheduled for the day the war ended. Therefore, the meeting became a preparatory meeting for the formation of a new party. They were among the first to set up political parties. There were others who also tried to form political parties. There were communists and socialists who had been targeted for repression during the war. They found themselves in a situation where if they used words like communism or socialism they would immediately be oppressed. So they avoided these and operated under the name Musan. Propertyless means people who have no assets. People like this also began to take action after the defeat in the war. They too began preparations to form political parties in preparation for the new era that would come after the war. Thus, the Japan Socialist Party was born. The Japan Socialist Party was founded with the aim of creating a political party that advocates socialism and democracy. At the same time, they also set the goal of uniting the proletarian party. This made running the party increasingly difficult. The various proletarian party had been in ideological conflict even before the war. There were political parties with different lines, such as the left-wing Japan Proletarian Party, the centrist Japan Labor Farmer Party, and the right-wing Social Democratic Party. These opposing forces were united into one party. As a result, it became difficult for them to unite under a clear ideology as a socialist party. Within the party there were various factions, from left to right. As a result, the party's policy was not clear. Oppose militarism and strive for peace. Abolish capitalism and implement socialism. Aiming to establish a democratic system, the Japan Socialist Party was formed on such vague ideals. Because it was a socialist party, it received support mainly from the proletariat, or working class. About a week after the formation of the Japan Socialist Party, a new political party was formed with Ichiro Hatoyama as its president. This is the Japan Liberal Party. He was originally from the Rikken Seijukai. As a result, many members of parliament who were members of the Rikken Seijukai gathered together. On the other hand, newcomers such as scholar Tsukichi Minobe and journalist Tanzan Ishibashi also participated. There was also an aim to create a new political party including newcomers. These are the basic policies of the Japan Liberal Party. Let's voluntarily implement the Potsdam Declaration and build a new Japan. Let's preservation the national polity and strive to be a democratic and free country. In other words, the party aimed to create a democratic and free Japan without making major changes to the country's structure. It was also a conservative, liberal party that focused on post-war reconstruction and economic rebuilding. At the founding convention of the Japan Liberal Party, Hatoyama gave the following speech. Preservation of the Emperor of Japan system. Elimination of the dictatorship of the proletariat. Maintaining private property. We have to commit to these things. This idea was the exact opposite of that of the communists, who aimed to abolish the Emperor of Japan system, establish the dictatorship of the proletariat, and abolish private property. From this, it is clear that the Japan Liberal Party was a party that opposed communism. In this way, the lawmakers who were not recommended in the Yokusan elections were relatively free from war responsibility. That is why they were able to start forming new parties early on and establish the Japan Socialist Party and the Japan Liberal Party. On the other hand, the lawmakers who had been recommended in the Yokusan elections were worried that GHQ would hold them accountable for their wartime actions. So they had a hard time coming together as one. However, running in the House of Representatives election without forming a political party was a disadvantage for them. So they also formed political parties somewhat later. This is the Japan Progressive Party. Shuji Machida, who served as president of the Constitutional Democratic Party before the war, has been appointed president of the Japan Progressive Party. The Japan Progressive Party was born in this way, and was therefore conservative despite its name. Furthermore, the Japanese Communist Party, which was an illegal political party before the war and ceased operations due to severe repression, was rebuilt after the war. Kyuichi Tokuda, who was released under a human rights directive, became the party's secretary general. The Japanese Communist Party had a policy of overthrowing the Emperor of Japan system and establishing a republican government based on the consensus of the people. They also advocated the overthrow of capitalism and the creation of communism. Furthermore, they viewed the American occupation forces as a liberation force from militarism. On the day that communist leaders like Kyuichi Tokuda were released, a people's conference was held to welcome them. The participants held a demonstration march. There was also an incident where they shouted "Long live the occupying forces" in front of GHQ headquarters and dispersed. At that time, Japan was already in the midst of chaos. Under these circumstances, if they had taken action aimed at bringing about an armed communist revolution, society would have been in danger of falling into further chaos. For this reason, shortly after the war, the Japanese Communist Party adopted a moderate, peaceful revolutionary approach. They began operating as a legal political party. Industrial union leaders also formed political parties by bringing together rural members. This is the Japan Cooperative Party. The Japan Cooperative Party did not have much influence and was quickly absorbed by other parties. But their philosophy was unique. The Japan Cooperative Party based its ideological foundation on people such as farmers, small and medium-sized businesses, and workers. Let's all help each other and carry out economic activities. Let's create a system to distribute profits fairly. Let's stop prioritizing the profits of capitalists and zaibatsu. Let's aim to create a society where local people work together to improve their lives. They had this kind of idea. In this way, the major post-war political parties were largely formed. But the general election had yet to be held. So these parties had no seats in parliament. Thus, the wartime parliament remained in place and preparations for the next elections were underway. The revision of the House of Representatives election law was at the center of this effort. The amendment included granting women the right to vote and lowering the voting age from 25 to 20. This expanded the number of eligible voters to approximately 3 times the previous number. Thus, the groundwork was laid for holding the first general election since the war. After these preparations, the Shidehara cabinet dissolved the House of Representatives in order to hold a general election. And finally, the first post-war elections were about to be held. However, GHQ took action. GHQ halted the immediate holding of elections, citing the need to examine whether the revised election law was democratic. But this was just the official reason. The real reason why GHQ decided to postpone the election was closely related to a certain policy they were pursuing at the time. The policy was to purge from public office. GHQ kept a close eye on the newly formed political parties in Japan. They rated each party as follows. The Japan Progressive Party is the successor to the Imperial Rule Assistance Association and cannot be expected to do much in the new Japan. Contrary to its name, the Japan Liberal Party is conservative, and their liberalism is just thought, not action. It may be unfair to describe the Japan Cooperative Party as undemocratic, but they represent the right wing of Japanese political thought. In this way, GHQ maintained a critical eye over many political parties. On the other hand, they had certain expectations of the Japan Socialist Party. They viewed the party as having problems with unity, but that its lineup and policies were the most promising. In other words, this was GHQ's thinking. If a general election were held now, people who were well known from before the war would likely win. Elections should not be held under these circumstances. Before the general election, those who cooperated with the war effort during the war must be removed from public office. They came to this decision. Thus, GHQ postponed the general election and carried out a purge from public office in the meantime. So what kinds of people were expelled from public office? War criminal, occupation army and navy man, members of nationalist groups, influential elements of the Imperial Rule Assistance Association, the Yokusen Seijikai, and the Greater Japan Political Association, officers of companies connected to colonies and occupied territories. Others are militarists or extreme nationalists. Such a distinction was made. Naturally, this purge from public office had a huge impact on the government and political parties. For example, 5 ministers from the Shidehara cabinet were targeted for expulsion. Shidehara Kijiro expressed strong dissatisfaction, saying, "It is impossible to run a cabinet like this." At one point he even considered resigning. However, after being persuaded by other cabinet ministers and MacArthur, he decided not to resign. A cabinet reshuffle helped him weather this crisis. The impact on each political party was also enormous. The Japan Progressive Party was particularly severely affected. Of the party's 274 members of the House of Representatives, 260 were expelled. This was a devastating blow to them. This was due to GHQ's strict policy that anyone recommended in the Yokusan elections was subject to expulsion. Its president, Shuji Machida, has also been expelled from public office. As a result, the Japan Progressive Party was left without a president and was in chaos. The purge from public office had a major impact on other political parties as well. In the Japan Liberal Party, 30 of the 43 members were expelled. In the Japan Socialist Party, 11 of 17 members were expelled. The entire political world was thrown into great turmoil. Nevertheless, the election was scheduled to take place. The political parties had no choice but to prepare for it. The socialists advocated the immediate formation of a popular front. They positioned themselves as democratic forces and called for their unity. At that time, Sanzo Nosuke, a leader of the Japanese Communist Party who had been in the Soviet Union and China, returned to Japan. The National Welcome Party for Sanzo Nosuke was held in Hibiya Park. There, he used the catchphrase "the beloved Communist Party." Through these movements, the ideas of socialism and communism were gaining support within Japan. Ichiro Hatoyama felt a strong sense of crisis about this trend. He called for conservative forces to unite around an anti-communist agenda. He took a clear stance against communism. Thus, 2 opposing axes were formed, the Popular Front and the Anti-Communist League, which would later be known as the Progressive and Conservative Forces.